Welcome back to JavaScript Fundamentals. Today we are going to start a multi-day look at events. And the reason why we are going to spend so much time on events is because they are so very important to JavaScript programming in the browser. A lot of times we execute code whenever the browser loads the code into the browser, just as we have done in practically every lesson so far. But the majority of the time we want to execute code based upon what the user does. So whenever they perform some event, either clicking a mouse button or pressing a key on their keyboard or even just moving their mouse around on the page, we typically want to do something based upon that event that occurred. So events are an extremely important part of JavaScript because they are such a huge part of what we do within the browser. So today we are going to get started by looking at just an introduction to events. We're going to look at some examples, and then we will actually delve into some of the early event handlers, which were used several years ago, but they are still useful today. Let's look at some examples first. The first is a demonstration that I wrote up. It's just a few lines of code. There's nothing fancy here. In fact, it's very boring considering what you can do with events. But whenever I click on this element, this box is going to change color from blue to red. So I will click on it, and there we go. It changed to red. And I wrote code that listens for whenever the user clicks on this element. And when they do, then it executes my code and changes this element's color to red. So if you want to look at that, it's just a few lines. We first get the element object, and then we use something called an event handler. This is the on-click event handler for the click event. And whenever someone clicks on this element, this event handler is going to execute, and it's nothing more than a function. But inside of the function, we use the this keyword to refer to the element object that this event handler is for. We use the style object, the background color property, and we set that as red. So that's a very simple way of writing an event. Well, let's look at another example, and this is much more complex, but it'll give you an idea of what we can do. I'm sure that if you've used Google, then you've seen two things. You've seen the instant search whenever you start typing, and then you've also seen the suggestions that occur whenever you start typing. Well, this is all based on events. Whenever you start typing, those are events that take place, and the engineers at Google had to write code to handle these key press events. So let's start searching for JavaScript, and you can see that the page is automatically changing based upon whatever we are typing. And all of this is possible because events allow the developers to interact with whatever it is that we are doing with the web page. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a very enriching experience with Google's search engine. So let's go back to our code and let's look at how we can use events within our web page. So let's first look at our HTML, and I want to put your attention on line 20, our script element. Now, I'm not going to go through why we put it at the bottom of the page because we've been there and done that. But I did mention, I think just once, that we used to put our script elements at the top of the page, or at least within the head, so that they would be loaded first. But this poses a problem, especially with our script, because our script tries to find an element with an ID of box and then set the on-click event handler. Well, by the time that the browser loads our JavaScript code, that element does not exist within the document yet because the browser hasn't loaded it. So whenever we try to execute this code, we are going to get an error. So let me refresh, pull up the JavaScript console, and we can see that we are getting an error because we cannot set a property of onClick on a null object. And we are getting a null object because getElementById is returning null. It cannot find the element with an ID of box. So if we tried to click on this element, nothing is going to happen because we could never set the event handler for that element. So we used to get around this by using an event handler called onLoad, because every browser has an event called load that fires or executes whenever the browser is finished loading the page. And this is actually a property of window. So we would do window.onload, or you could just do onload, and then we would assign a function to execute whenever the load event fired. And so now we have wrapped the code that we had before that finds the element and then sets up an event handler for it. This will execute whenever the browser is finished loading the document within the browser. So now it will be able to find this element with an ID of box and set its event handler. So if I refresh, our error is going to go away and then our code behaves as it should. So why should we use the onload event handler and cause some extra overhead whenever we can just put our script element at the bottom of the page? And that is one of the reasons why we do that now. It's less code that we have to write, and it's less overhead as far as the browser is concerned. So that is one way that we used to use events within the browser, but we no longer do. Well, let's do something from scratch. Let's do a simple style switcher. That will be a little bit more exciting than changing the background color of an element. And we will do so by changing the class name, which can or cannot be more exciting depending upon your preference. But we will change the class of the body element so that we will have a normal class. So let's go ahead and specify that. We'll give it a background color of white and a text color of black, very normal. And then let's have another class called changed. So changed, and we will reverse these values. So background color will be black, color will be white. We also need some different content. So let's do h1, hello events. Let's also have a paragraph that has, oh, la-dee-da. And then we need something to click on in order to change the class of our body. We can use any element that we want. It doesn't have to be an A element, which accepts clicking by default. We could use div elements, we can use spans, we can use anything, because the click event is going to be done through JavaScript. But let's do something like a button. So we will do two buttons. One will be called normal, and then the second will be changed. So let's go to our JavaScript, get rid of the code that we have here, and then view this page in the browser so that we can just see what we are dealing with. And that looks great. We have some content, and then we have two buttons that whenever we click on, we will be changing the style of the page. So let's go back and let's set up these events so that whenever these button elements are clicked, then we will do something. So the first thing we need to get are the element objects, and we can do that by specifying an ID attribute for each of these button elements, but that kind of duplicates our code so that we would have to write the same event handler, well, not the same event handler, but we would have to write two event handlers for both of those buttons. Let's do something a little bit more complicated and a little bit more interesting. So let's first create a variable called buttons, and let's use the document.getElements by tag name method so that we are getting all of the buttons within this document. And then let's use a loop. So var I equals 0, length equals buttons.length, I is less than length, and then I equals I plus 1. There we go. And then inside of this loop, we are going to use buttons, I for the index, and then we set on click. And now we have our event handler. So let's go ahead and test this. Let's use an alert, and let's just say hello. So whenever we run this in the browser and we execute or we click on both of these buttons, we will see an alert. There we go. Hello and hello. So now we just need to determine which button is clicked on and then change the class name to the appropriate class name. And if you haven't noticed, normal matches the normal class and changed matches the changed class. So we could get these values that's contained within the button elements, lowercase them, and then use those as the class name. So we can use the inner HTML property to do that. Now, granted, this isn't the best solution. There's actually better ways of doing what we are doing, but for this particular demonstration, this is going to work just fine. So let's create a variable. Let's call it class name. And then let's use the this variable because we are referring to this button. This.innerHTML and then to lowercase. This is going to get the value of normal or changed and then make them lowercase. And then we will simply do document.body.className equal class name. And that should work. So let's go back to the browser. Let's refresh and let's click on changed. There we go. And if we click on normal, there we go. And if we click on normal while we are using the normal class, then nothing's going to happen. The same is true with changed. If we are using the class name of changed and we click the change button, nothing's going to happen. But we have at least changed the class name of the body based upon whatever button that we click. So that's still pretty simple, but it's a little bit more interesting than before. And the event handlers that we've been using today are called DOM Level 0 event handlers. They are called Level 0 because they existed before any DOM standard existed. And that's very good because every browser supports DOM Level 0 event handlers. And the reason why that's good is because there are newer ways of setting up event handlers. There's a standard way, and then there's a legacy Internet Explorer way. But not every browser supports either the standard or the legacy IE. So sometimes we do have to fall back to these DOM Level 0 event handlers. But there is a little tiny problem. Well, it's not little, it's a very big problem in that these are volatile, in that they can only contain one function at a time. So if we want to execute multiple functions for this onClick event handler, well, we can't, because on line 12, we have just overwritten the event handler that we wrote starting at line 6. So if we go back to the browser and refresh, we aren't going to see anything occur. So this was a problem if you were using DOM Level 0 event handlers in your code and you used somebody else's code that did the same thing and overwrote your event handlers, well then they just broke your code. So that's why there's a newer and better way of setting up event handlers so that you can set up as many functions as you want to execute whenever an event occurs, so that there's no conflicting event handlers or anything like that. And that's where we will pick up in the next lesson. We are going to finish with what we have here for today. So have a good one. I will see you next time.